proposed repeal of the VOC regulations of Pulaski County. Our team, including Kelly Jobe and Iris has helped as well, have put together a technical support document going over a weight of evidence analysis of why these regulations are no longer necessary. We've put a proposed version or a draft version up on the web. However, it's still a working copy. I think we still made changes to it as of last week, but the evidence we present is still current. So I'm going to just provide a history of these regulatory requirements, give you an overview of the air quality trends in Pulaski County, talk about some air quality modeling that's been done, our emissions inventory, as well as how emissions are controlled by other programs besides those regulations of Pulaski County. So some history. In 1971, a 1-hour national ambient air quality standard of 0.08 ppm was set. Pulaski County was designated non-attainment in March of 1978. In January of the next year, EPA revised the standard to make it less stringent, 0.12 parts per million. We developed our those regulations of Pulaski County and the SIP revisions where we make them federally enforceable to show EPA this is how we're going to reattain the standard. We submitted our original one in March of 1979, but then we revised it 3 more times to include other control technique guidelines that EPA had wanted us to include. And then in 1984, Pulaski County was redesignated to attainment and has remained in attainment ever since. So I usually don't like to have very wordy slides, but I thought this quote from the original state implementation plan was very telling. And so I'll just apologize that I'm going to read it verbatim because I find it amusing. So this is back when we were submitting our first requirements. Although laboratory studies have shown that ozone is created by reactions involving volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides in the presence of sunlight, there has been no practical demonstration that a relatively low ambient standard can be achieved through reductions of only volatile organic compounds. And we've got some evidence that we'll provide later to show that that continues. There's been evidence, not necessarily laboratory evidence, but photochemical modeling evidence and so forth that shows that statement, that there was no evidence to support that getting us back into non-attainment was true and is not particularly effective in Pulaski County. That's not to say that it's not effective elsewhere. So we adopted control measures based on EPA guidance that were published prior to January 1978, and that pretty much, other than adopting in those 3 subsequent revisions, more of those control technique guidelines that were prior to 1978, they haven't really been touched since. The measures were intended to achieve a 20% reduction in anthropogenic VOC emissions. This was based on the EPA rollback model. So the measures included reasonably available control technology for both point and area sources, as well as lowest achievable emission rate for proposed new sources, large sources that have the potential to emit over 100 tons per year of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. So some of the provisions for specific processes, the gasoline storage and marketing, petroleum liquid storage, and cutback asphalt provisions were adopted in the original 1979 regulation, but the gasoline storage and marketing was actually revised again in 1979. And then in 1980, we added the surface coating of metal parts and products, and in 1981, the external floating roofs provisions. So these regulations of VOC regulations of Pulaski County used to be their own separate regulation, and then when we consolidated all of the state implementation plan regulations into 19, they were also moved into 19, and so now they're housed in Regulation 19, Chapter 10, But as you know from our earlier presentation, we now have SIP provisions in 26 and 31 also. So our goal of moving all the SIP provisions to one regulation, we've had some divergence there. So now I kind of want to go, that's a little bit of the history, I want to go into some of the evidence for why we don't think this is necessary. So we've had tightening ozone standards. So we started out with that 0.12, and then in 1997 we went to 0.08 over an 8-hour. Became more stringent in 2008, became more stringent again in 2015, and even as those standards have become more stringent, Pulaski County has remained in attainment for ozone. So because we're kind of looking at two different forms of standards, we're looking at the original 1 hour, which is what we were designated as non-attainment for, and now we have an 8-hour. We've got some charts that just kind of show where we've been over the course of going back to our original designation. And you can see the y-axis is the number of times that we've hit the 0.12 over a 1 hour average in the form of the standard. And you can do that once per year before you get a non-attainment designation. So you'll see back in the, I'm not sure exactly the year of that one. Back in the early 80s, you'll see that there was a year where we hit it 3 times, and then going into the mid 80s up into 2000, we only hit it once per year, so we wouldn't have been in non-attainment for that standard even if it had continued to exist. And this is compared to the 8-hour standard, and you can see that the trend has been going downwards, and we're in attainment of that standard. You can see, do we have a laser pointer?
Yeah.
Is that it?
Oh, no.
Yes.
Thank you, sorry. So the 1997, which was the first 1 hour standard, was around here, and that was a 0.08 part per million standard. So you can see we were a little bit above that after that, but we didn't end up getting a non-attainment designation. But we've been trending downwards and are expecting to remain in attainment for even the most new stringent 2015 acts. So EPA has also done some air quality modeling. The reason they did this was for ozone advanced areas, which are areas that are in attainment of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, but are pretty close net risk of going non-attainment. So our technical support document describes this modeling effort that EPA undertook, and we're also going to be including it as an appendix to our technical support document. And it does a sensitivity analysis to look at what's more effective at achieving ozone air quality reductions. Is nitrogen oxide emission reductions more effective, or VOC emission reductions more effective? And it also projected future ozone design values. So why would we want to look at a sensitivity analysis? Well, if you have limited funds in an ozone advanced area and you want to maybe offer grants or incentives for folks to reduce their emissions, you want to target something that's actually going to make a difference, right? You don't want to put a lot of money into reducing a certain pollutant if that's not going to end up with any effect on the pollutant of concern. So their sensitivity analyses, they did this based on a 2011 modeling platform. They did the peak 8-hour maximum over the course of the month of June for 2011, and that was a particularly hot year. A lot of folks, we'll get into the year later. But so they did what if the entire country reduced the anthropogenic VOC emissions by 50%, what would the outcome of the modeling be? And same thing for nitrogen oxides. They did a couple different runs. So this is what would happen if there was a nationwide 50% cut in anthropogenic VOCs. The green indicates that we're going down a little bit in ozone concentration. Red would be an increase in ozone concentration. And so you can see there are a few areas that would benefit from VOC reductions, but you'll notice there is no green in Arkansas. This is the same sensitivity analysis, but with nitrogen oxide emission reductions instead of VOC emission reductions. And you can see most of the country stands to benefit from that. So closer to the blue and green colors are less ozone. Red would be an increase. And there are a couple of exceptions up in the Great Lakes area and North Atlantic. There are a couple of areas where ozone would go up if you decrease NOx. And that the ozone reaction it can go forward or backwards. So if you have a lot of NOx in an area, it'll tend to mitigate some of the ozone. It'll go the opposite way in the reaction, but then downwind you'll have ozone issues. So you can see Arkansas, much more affected by a nationwide reduction in nitrogen oxide emissions, not so much with VOC for the sensitivity analysis. And this is kind of where they did a comparison. They did a ratio of the two sensitivity analyses, and the places in purple are where it would be more effective. So the greater the magnitude, the more purple, the more sensitive you are to NOx reductions relative to VOC. So some general conclusions of that modeling effort. Ozone sensitivity to emission reductions of NOx versus VOC. In most of the country outside of urban areas, the impacts of NOx cuts are more than 10 times more effective at reducing ozone than the impact of the same amount of VOC cuts. In most cities, you still see that the nitrogen oxide or NOx emissions are more effective if you reduce those than the VOCs, but the magnitude of the impact difference is not quite as high. And then there are a few urban areas, Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, Miami, Cleveland, New York, where VOC cuts would be more impactful than nitrogen oxide cuts. But again, most of the country, the VOC cuts aren't really going to do much for your ozone. So the guidance is just focusing your ozone reduction efforts more on reducing nitrogen oxide emissions. So I also want to talk about our emission inventory. So this is the 2014 National Emission Inventory estimates by source category for Pulaski County. You'll notice we're dominated by biogenics. So mobile is another big, not big source. It's still mostly biogenics. But one of the things about ozone chemistry that we think about is, okay, you need to have enough VOCs to kind of help the reaction go along, but it's not concentration dependent after a certain point with the VOCs. You just have to have enough present for the reaction to go forward. So because we're a heavily forested area, we have lots of biogenics, and then in the Delta, a lot of plant life, those all produce their own volatile organic compounds. So we have enough in our atmosphere already to facilitate that reaction. So some emissions, we also talked about what those specific VOC regulations of Pulaski County regulate and what percentage of our emission inventory those actually control. And it's very small, it's about 4% total of the Pulaski County emission inventory that are regulated under that, those were like regulations of Pulaski County, Regulation 19, Chapter 10. And we did that 4% estimate based on looking at the SEC codes that would be controlled. Those are the source classification codes. However, those categories are more general than the specific requirements we have in Regulation 19. So we may actually be capturing some emissions that aren't regulated under there. So the 4% is likely to be an overestimate. This is our nitrogen oxides emissions. I just threw this in just kind of to give you a comparison. You'll see a lot of it is mobile in this area, both diesel and non-diesel. This chart I think is particularly telling. On the left-hand axis, we're looking at tons of emissions of VOCs and NOx. So the blue line is your NOx emissions, the red line is the VOC emissions, and then the green line actually corresponds to the right-hand axis. That's design value in parts per million. So you'll see that over this kind of 10-year look back, 2002 was the first national emission inventory year, so that's the first year of data we have for this. You'll see that VOC emissions have actually gone up, whereas NOx have gone down, and ozone, you'll notice the slope of the line for ozone is very similar to the slope of the line for the nitrogen oxide emission reductions. So this is another piece of evidence that we think shows that having those VOC regulations in Pulaski County aren't particularly effective for ozone. In addition, a lot of those specific processes that we would be have requirements that we'd be repealing are already governed by other programs. So new source review requirements, the regulations of Pulaski County came into effect before we had Regulation 31. We're retaining Regulation 31 provisions. There'll be their own chapters within the new streamlined regulation. And then we also have the Title V and minor new source review programs. Gasoline storage and marketing, we have a few national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants that cover that already. Petroleum liquid storage, we have some new source performance standards as well as some existing source performance standards that cover that. Cutback asphalt, this one's actually been interesting. We had an issue a few years ago where somebody was asking a question about this. We had some restrictions that said you can't lay this cutback asphalt except for this specific situation if it's above a certain temperature. And that was to prevent more volatilization from the laying of the cutback asphalt. However, the highway department said that they couldn't lay the cutback asphalt unless it was below the same temperature. We had a conflict there where basically between our regulation and their regulation, we were, except for that one exemption, preempting anybody from using cutback asphalt in Pulaski County. Looking at the emissions from VOCs from asphalt in general, asphalt application in general, not just cutback asphalt, but all asphalt application in Pulaski County, it makes up less than 1%, quite a bit less than 1% of the VOC emission inventory for Pulaski County, only about 2 tons per year. So gasoline trucks, again, we have national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants for that. There's 3 of them. Surface coating of metal products and parts. We have new source performance standards and NESHAPs. And external floating roofs, again, we have NESHAPs that cover that stuff. So in addition to those specific processes being regulated by other federal standards, there have been at least 148 federal rules that have been promulgated subsequent to the adoption of these initial regulations in 1979, in the early 1980s, that also reduce volatile organic compound and NOx emissions. So some examples, some of those NESHAPs that I've listed, new source performance standards, the acid rating program, as well as interstate trading programs, the various iterations we've had of them. So, and that's just a partial list. Also, mobile source emission standards and so forth. So we think we have a lot of evidence to show that that chapter and those requirements are no longer necessary. We've put our technical support document on the website and we're looking for feedback, as well as for the entirety of our Streamlining project. So, do you have any questions, thoughts?
Tricia, I had one question. It's not so much for the changes, but that slide back where you showed the trends of the NOx and VOC, can you go back to that?
Yeah.
What led to that big VOC emissions increase there between 2005 and 2008?
So I'm not exactly sure what happened. I didn't drill down into specific source categories for that. I will say that 2000 and 2005, the National Emission Inventory methodology was very similar, and in some cases, they just copied their estimates from 2005 or 2002 into the 2005 inventory. They did a lot of revisions in methodology in 2008 that have continued. They've used similar methodology since. So it may not actually be that large of a jump. I'm sure there is some increase, but there may also be some methodology issues there.
Yeah, it just caught my eye. I thought that
Yep.
was...
But those are the best estimates we have.
Sure.
So I think I'll turn it over to Will. We're going to do Q&A. I guess we're going to move the podium.
I guess before we get started, I just want to ask, just because we only had one question, can you just raise your hand if you're going to be commenting or asking a question, and we can go ahead and sit up there, but I just want to see if anybody's actually going to comment or make a question before we do that. Anybody else?
I have a question, but we don't
We do want to record. We're recording this. We're going to post it. So
we'll
we
go
do want
ahead.
people to come up to the mic.
I mean, well, all right,
That's all right.
Okay, great.
Okay.
there's just a couple of kind of questions to see if you want what you're on to.
Sure.
So I guess we're all going to say here's lots of questions.
My questions are pretty.
Sure. Go ahead, Nancy.
So, you said you're working on a strong draft of the SIP right now that's going to incorporate portions of Reg 35.
No, it's-
Yes.
So you're going to incorporate certain portions of Reg 35 into a revised SIP. So some portions of Reg 35 will not be put into a revised SIP. So is the intent that the portions that are not will be state enforceable provisions?
That's correct.
only? And so the index that y'all providing on your website, you've already gone into that and provided which, because I'm sorry, I haven't looked into that, so.
No worries.
You provided which parts are, you intend to put into the revised SIP.
Yes.
Okay. But it's not finalized yet, you guys are still working on it?
Right, so we have an index of changes, and that will be on our website along with the strawman draft, and it says whether each provision is going to be SIP or not. We have drafted some of the SIP revision based on our current iteration of the strawman draft. However, because we're taking feedback from everyone, that's subject to change based on whether or not we get any feedback that necessitates changes to the regulation itself. We did upload the VOC Pulaski County technical support document, which will be part of the SIP. I anticipate we probably will share a pre-initiation draft of the SIP, but probably once we actually know whether we're going to be making changes to the reg.
Yeah, so the pre-initiation draft, my next question is, will that be part of the stakeholder process? Will we be able to look at that? And are you going to have another stakeholder meeting?
Well, I mean, we're open to holding another stakeholder meeting, and we want to get our input, so I imagine we would put out the draft SIP sometime after August 20th, so we can take a look at the comments before we release the draft SIP. I mean, if you're interested in doing a separate stakeholder process on the SIP itself, I mean, it can be sort of abbreviated. I don't have a problem with that. We're interested in your comments on that, so you can send an email or just we'll know that you're interested.
So, and we'll make a note on it and talk to Stuart and see, whether he, when he thinks it's ready for sharing, and it's possible we can kind of roll these two together, because I think we want to propose them together, because they're inextricably linked. If we make changes to the reg, we're going to have to make changes to the SIP. The SIP has a lot of just the justification of how we're continuing to meet our Clean Air Act requirements despite stripping certain requirements out.
Any other questions, comments?
I'd just like to get an idea about the anticipated timeline for whenever you would, or else we're having a stakeholder meeting about this particular, not the SIP, but about the Reg 36. What is your anticipated month that you would initiate rulemaking on this after you've heard all the comments that we have to provide?
So we do have a slide about that in our next type session, but I'll go ahead and, answer some, what happened there?
Hit the maps.
Oh, actually, you want me to go ahead and put that slide up? It might be helpful.
It just says, fall. I think we're thinking October. It depends on the amount of comments we get as well. If there's some drastic revisions, we may push it back.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, October or the December commission meeting is what we're targeting, preferably October, but yeah, if we have to do a lot of, if we get a lot of feedback that, hey, you didn't cover this, or hey, what about this? Oh, we need to do a technical justification for why this is okay, that's gonna add time.
Thanks.
What's your deadline for comments?
August 20th. And of course, you will have another opportunity to comment on the record if and when the commission initiates rulemaking. So these are, we were hoping we could get a lot of issues or concerns out front if there are already problems people foresee or unintended consequences that we didn't necessarily mean, and get those changes in before we even go to initiate, and then hopefully, we'll have a smoother rulemaking process.
Anyone else? Okay, last call. Go on.
Well, not last call totally, because you can
Great.
also send us email comments. We want your feedback. This is not your last opportunity to talk, period, but for this session.
Well, I had one quick question, which I know you obviously don't want to be making too many changes to the rule, and it's really more of an administrative exercise that you're trying to do here right now. But is there any opportunity for stakeholders to suggest changes to, in particular, to any of the state-specific rules that aren't going to be part of the state implementation plan? Is there any opportunity there to kind of revise things that have been problematic for certain facilities, or that sometimes may be more strict than what the federal rules require?
We're open to more suggestions. Like I said, our goal is not to make a lot of substantive changes, but we're happy to look at your comments and
Right.
talk about them internally.
Okay. I think that's it.
Anybody else? All right, I guess that's it for real estate. I guess we'll have one more session where I will just walk down and wrap everything up, and that'll be it. So I know we just probably talked about most of this, but this is our general next steps all lined out in a row, so you can kind of see it sequentially what we're thinking. We are going to